Je vais être dans live dans 3 secondes.
OK, we're on now. Bonsoir tout le monde, bienvenue à cette belle soirée pour la Commission de la capitale nationale, un événement qui se concentre sur l'environnement, plus spécifiquement l'équité sociale ainsi qu'environnementale dans le domaine de la planification urbaine. Alors pour ce soir, nous avons des invités qui regroupent des expériences qui sont assez variées, mais qui nous unifient par rapport à la concentration de l'urbanisme ainsi que surtout sur la culture et les avancements sociaux qui en développent. Alors, sur ce, je passerai le micro à notre premier dirigeant pour vous faire une petite introduction.
Hello, bonjour, Kwei Kikina. I would like to begin my remarks this evening by recognizing that I am here today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation, here in the NCC's Urbanism Lab. Thank you for joining us for this evening's session. Si vous faites partie de notre auditoire fidèle, bienvenue à nouveau. Et si c'est votre première conférence, j'espère que vous aimerez la discussion de ce soir et que vous participez à nos autres séances. I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentations because our topic is one of the areas where we, as capital planners, can really make a dramatic difference in people's lives and perhaps even right some historic wrongs. Environmental justice is the idea that everyone, regardless of their neighborhood, their ethnicity, their economic status, is entitled to a clean and healthy community and the equal responsibility to share the burden of environmental challenges. There's a massive volume of research that demonstrates that the effects of pollution and climate change and a lack of access to the outdoors and green spaces are borne disproportionately by disadvantaged and racialized communities. Que les notions de justice environnementale soient enchâssées ou non dans les lois, nous avons un certain impératif moral à chercher à les appliquer. And I would add that we have the ability and the responsibility to make changes to correct instances of environmental injustice, and in planning for the future, make sure it's not perpetuated on future generations. These ideas already inform a lot of what we do at the NCC, particularly with regard to creating more equal access to green spaces. To use one example, Le Breton Flats. Access to high-quality public parks and the riverfront is a concept that's baked into the project's master concept plan as one of its 7 guiding principles, as is the provision of inclusive and affordable housing. La planification du projet Bâtir le Breton est un bel exemple d'intégration des notions de justice environnementale. Et le réaménagement de la pointe Nepean et les parcs linéaires prévus sur les 2 rives de la rivière des Outils sont autant de projets améliorant l'accès aux espaces verts et aux berges dans la capitale. But that's not all. We have other interesting initiatives, including a project undertaken by NCC staff to overlay socioeconomic statistics with the results of our recent tree canopy study to really identify which disadvantaged parts of the capital need greater access to nature so we can incorporate that information into our future plans. And of course, our Parkways for People pilot this past summer saw the NCC open over 50% of its roadways for people, bringing safe, active spaces to many neighborhoods in the capital. So, using those projects as examples, you can see that we are increasingly incorporating an equity lens into our work. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have 3 guests to spark this very important discussion of environmental justice. So let me introduce the speakers now. Carlton Eley is an urban planner and president of the Eley Group, which advises public and private sector clients on matters including environmental justice. Previously, he spent 20 years with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he was the first urban planner hired by the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, and he has also chaired the American Planning Association's Social Equity Task Force. Our second speaker tonight is Ingrid Waldron, who is an associate professor at Dalhousie University's Faculty of Health and director of the Enrich Project, which is studying the effects of environmental injustice throughout the province of Nova Scotia. She's also the author of the award-winning book, There's Something in the Water, which this year became a Netflix documentary of the same name. So go and check it out. And lastly, our third speaker is Katherine Howard, who is a project manager with the City of Vancouver's Board of Parks and Recreation, where she recently developed a long-term vision for the city's park and recreation services with an emphasis on equity, inclusion, and analysis. This park and recreation service master plan includes a world first. It embeds in the organization's culture a tool to foster more equitable decision making. So very much looking forward to hearing from all three speakers. Thank you very much for joining us. Merci. So I'll stop there and let's get on with tonight's presentations.
So as we get things started this evening, I want to take the time to really say thank you for all who actually join us this evening, especially a special thanks to our U.S. Neighbors actually being able to view this particular event, as this is a national holiday, being Thanksgiving in the United States. And so we are very fortunate to be able to have our first speaker, Carlton Eley, part of this event in order to be able to get things started. Myself, my name is Gary Muse. I'm a senior landscape architect with the National Capital Commission, and I have the pleasure of moderating this event for you this evening. At the same time, Andrew Sacred, who is also moderating the event, is going to be in the back scenes of actually make things work as best as possible as we gather the questions and make things as easy as possible as we continue on for the event. So on that note, I will pass the microphone to Carlton in order to be able to get his presentation going, and hope that we are able to actually continue the conversation afterward as we look forward to the other presentations to continue on the discussion. Carlton, over to you. Oh, real quick, Carlton.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good evening, all, and thank you, Gary, for the introduction. And I want to thank the National Capital Commission for extending the invitation to participate and offer brief remarks. After wrapping up my career in public service, I became president of the Eley Group. And we are a consulting firm that works at the intersection of equity and urban planning. And we're in the business of giving sustainability a push. I was asked to take a few minutes this evening to simply explain how experts and communities are threading the needle between environmental justice and planning. Today's discussion is important, and it also serves as a reminder of the importance of addressing unfinished business. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Normally, when I offer remarks on this topic, I tend to emphasize history as prologue. I will not overwhelm you with a lot of history on this evening. However, the soundbite message is when we understand history in the context of city and regional planning, we can encourage better public policy and avoid repeating the same mistakes. Next slide, please. The scholarship of our profession is clear. The choices we make collectively have ripple effects. They can either alleviate vulnerability or they can amplify it. Last year, the American Planning Association decided it was time to send a clear message to its members, and it featured environmental justice as the cover story in their October issue of Planning Magazine. Next slide. My journey of working on these two issues actually started 20 years ago. I studied urban planning at the University of Iowa. When I graduated in 1998, I left with a degree in one hand and an unanswered question in the other. And the question was, what does the outcome look like when environmental justice is properly addressed through planning? The reason why I'm sharing this is because Randall Arendt reminded planners that the best professional assistance or professional preparation will actually extend beyond anything that you learned in a textbook. Instead, he encouraged practitioners to exercise the discipline to observe, record, communicate, and self-educate. In brief, working on issues of environmental justice and planning became my obsession over an extended period of time because I wanted to compensate for the things that I didn't learn in an academic setting. Next slide. Malcolm Gladwell popularized the 10,000 hour rule. Next slide, please. He popularized the rule as a standard for expertise. And I thought it would be appropriate to start with that reference on this evening because it really helps to amplify or demonstrate the fact that in my journey while working on issues of environmental justice and planning, I wasn't born an expert on this topic. Instead, I simply was willing to put in my 10,000 hours as a practitioner. For this reason, I wanted to start my remarks on this evening with a basic message of encouragement. And that is, planners should continue to be bold, to be curious, and to be mindful because the public is relying on us to move beyond our comfort zones. Next slide. Without being redundant, there are many factors that result in communities that may bear the disproportion of the pollution or exhibit conditions that are associated with environmental injustice. If you consider the topic of environmental justice as a spectrum of activity, you could easily identify work that is relevant to law, public health, waste management, or public involvement. And while these issues are important, it's also important to acknowledge the fact that environmental justice is equally a community planning issue. For example, in the United States, there are many communities that are dealing with environmental concerns that were prompted by a failure to plan, a failure to enforce proper zoning, or either the lingering effects associated with unlawful public policies like redlining, which denied communities access to capital and financing. Next slide. A groundswell of activity resulted in what we now call the environmental justice movement in the United States. And one of the gatherings that was very important when the movement was in its infancy was actually the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that occurred in 1991. Just like many place-based convenings or conferences that are held today, summit attendees thought critically about a set of characteristics that should be common in successful places. And the outcome was actually 17 principles of environmental justice. Time won't permit me to discuss these principles in detail, but I need to acknowledge that 5 of the principles are actually pertinent to planning, urban policy, and management of the built environment. The key takeaway about these 5 principles is we shouldn't be reluctant in making the connections between environmental justice and planning. When citizens gathered at the grassroots level and articulated their concerns about being overburdened by pollution, some of those concerns included untenable practices in housing, land use, infrastructure, and sanitation. So the point is that the connections have always been there because low-income and minority populations have always been concerned about the built environment. Next slide. I won't belabor the point, but I need to acknowledge that the first report that was published by the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council in December 1996 actually focused on redevelopment. Not only did the report identify the environmental benefits of urban redevelopment, but it also emphasized that the best outcomes would only come about through an inclusive process. In hindsight, this research could be interpreted as the Environmental Protection Agency's first study on sustainable communities. Also, this report is an important reminder of how forward-thinking environmental justice proponents have been over the years. My undergraduate studies were in sociology, which means I have a very strong appreciation for giving voice to the unspoken. And the lesson for city planners is that we need to be deliberate and intentional about taking the time to understand the narratives that have been left in the shadows, simply because some critics used to suggest that environmental justice is a distraction or is beyond our purview. Next slide. The practice of planning is not based on a static model. It is constantly adapting to new trends, opportunities, and challenges. In fact, we risk stifling the skills development of public servants, as well as the performance delivery of public organizations when we subscribe to narrow socialization boundaries. However, thanks to the tireless efforts of researchers and advocates, the creative thinking of planners and architects, as well as the compelling results of determined community builders, those barriers are coming down. Next slide. Planners are learning that we can do well while doing good. We're challenging outdated assumptions concerning the permanence of land use, as well as the capacity that exists within communities in order to effect change, and also in terms of how to address equity in a normalized manner. Today's discussion is important because proponents for environmental justice and practitioners who manage the built environment share a common interest. And one place where that common interest is evident is actually in the community of Bayview along Virginia's Eastern Shore. Next slide. In 1997, Bayview Citizens for Social Justice applied for an environmental justice small grant from the US EPA. The grant proposal focused on multiple water-related problems, but the community's living conditions were far more severe than anyone would have anticipated based on reviewing the proposal. At one point, 90% of Bayview's residents lived in substandard housing, 85% had no running water, and the community had no infrastructure for managing stormwater runoff. And again, this was 1997, not 1897. So residents in Bayview needed a design solution. With the assistance of an architect, residents opted to participate in a community-based planning process that included plans for building housing, for upgrading the sewer system, for adding community facilities, as well as spaces for public gathering. The activities undertaken in Bayview represented a 6-year, $10 million effort to rebuild a rural village along Virginia's Eastern Shore. Next slide. Equally important, the Bayview project had a cascading effect. It helped to solidify thinking amongst architects concerning an approach known as public interest design. In fact, Brian Bell, the director of Design Corps at North Carolina State University, has confirmed that the Bayview project is the first model of public interest design. Next slide. It's worth noting that interesting work is also occurring in National City, California, where residents are demonstrating that outdated and injurious policies can change. For example, industrial uses were permitted in the Old Town area of National City as a driver for economic development in the 1940s. This decision resulted in a short-term gain that did not outpace the long-term impact. Next slide. Residents and officials in National City were determined to reverse the damage following years of incompatible land uses that were interspersed throughout the Old Town area, including auto body shops, chrome platers, and goods movement from the San Diego port. Eventually, relief for residents came in the form of a community plan that was designed to correct the problems of conflicting land uses. This plan also included a vision for cleaning up Paradise Creek, as well as building new housing within the neighborhood. Because conditions were untenable, residents and intermediaries worked together to encourage a community-driven planning process. They were also convinced that the city's general plan needed to include an environmental justice element. Next slide. Citizens understood the benefits of encouraging environmental justice. One more slide. And they felt it was time for the city to acknowledge those benefits as well. Connie Leyva, who was a member of the California General Assembly, had a strong appreciation for the work that was occurring in National City. She understood the benefits of encouraging environmental justice as well. And as a member of the General Assembly, she actually introduced a bill that became a law in 2016. And now all local jurisdictions in the state of California, local governments and counties are required to include an environmental justice element in their general plan. National City's efforts are a reminder that communities don't become successful by accident. Instead, it requires an investment in time, energy, preparation, and planning. Next slide. Finally, I just want to state that in South Carolina, Harold Mitchell has been a force for change. In Spartanburg, the Arkwright and Forest Park neighborhoods are actually less than 2 miles from the city's center. Unfortunately, this section of the city is a place where residential neighborhoods and industry existed side by side due to few zoning restrictions and land use controls in the 1970s. In fact, the communities had 2 Superfund sites. One was a former fertilizer plant, and the other was a solid waste landfill. By the late 1990s, Harold Mitchell began to identify and understand that there was a clear connection between some of the health concerns that were being experienced by residents and the pollution that was occurring within his community. He took the initiative to interview residents, to conduct research on abandoned contaminated sites, and to convene community meetings. Also, he was successful in leveraging the support from the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, given the overwhelming set of challenges facing Arkwright and Forest Park, Harold opted to create a community organization called ReGenesis. And their mission was to represent neighborhood interests in cleaning up the contaminated sites and revitalizing the surrounding community. Although it took time and persistence, his collaborative efforts paid off because it resulted in a partnership that included the city, the county, the state environmental department, the EPA, the local housing authority, and the University of South Carolina Upstate. Next slide. Eventually, the work of the partnership led to a series of community design charrettes and a new vision for both neighborhoods. The work in Arkwright and in Forest Park are far from over, but residents are quite pleased with the progress in the form of a new $2 million health center, new housing, a much needed highway, additional green space, and new job opportunities. To date, Harold Mitchell has been successful in taking what was initially a $20,000 grant from EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and leveraging it into $300 million worth of community reinvestment. Also, Harold has expanded his role as a community advocate during the period of time that he served as a member of the South Carolina legislature. Next slide. So in closing, I just want to state that award-winning outcomes for equitable development are not the result of serendipity. Instead, they are the result of clearly set expectations, collaborative problem solving, and persistent leadership. Also, I just want to emphasize that the projects that I introduced during my remarks aren't the exception. Instead, we need to invest more time into understanding what makes them work, as well as elevating them within our dialogue as stewards of the built environment. Next slide. If you are interested in learning more about this topic, I just want to state that here are some resources that will allow you to remain informed. If you go to the next slide. The first point that I just want to make is the fact that there are a number of academics who are writing books that explore the sense of inertia that does occur within public agencies when attempting to advance social equity. When the shutdown occurred in March because of the pandemic, I had the opportunity to catch up on some reading, and I read a number of different books that were published by Dr. Susan T. Gooden and Jill Lindsay Harrison. Respectively, they have written about the topic of social equity in the context of public administration, as well as the importance of advancing environmental justice within government agencies. I also need to acknowledge that on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency website, there is a landing page that focuses on the intersection of environmental justice and equitable development. It's also worth noting that the American Planning Association has released an official public position on the topic of equity They published a Planning for Equity Policy Guide in April of 2019. And it's also worth noting that the American Planning Association published a Planning Advisory Service memo on the topic of equitable development in 2017 that helped to re-energize a conversation among planners that equity needs to be a priority as it relates to practice. Next slide. So in closing, I just want to state that it is a pleasure to have the opportunity to be here with the National Capital Commission. Gary, again, thank you for the introductions as well as for extending the invitation to participate. And I'm happy to address any questions that we may have during the Q&A period.
Thank you so much, Carlton, for the presentation and sharing the valuable information as well as experience throughout your career, and really looking at giving us the type of feedback that is needed in order to be able to give those next steps as well, from the planners to architects, landscape architects, the tools needed in order to be able to really move forward in an equitable manner. One small question, I think, that to start things off on your end from your presentation, from your vast experience, how have you been able to see a shift within the paternalistic view of development throughout the early stages of planning to how things have transformed themselves in the current form, with how the variety of planning projects that come in as far as new development, new subdivisions? Has there been more of a community-based approach toward really making sure that people's voices are heard toward those developments taking place in the U.S.?
Thanks for asking that question, and I'll try to offer a brief response, given the fact that we have other presenters who will be offering remarks as well. I think one of the things that we do need to acknowledge about this current era that we're in, as we make this point of pivoting, is the fact that there's really a groundswell of grassroots interest in the topic of advancing equity in the context of planning. This isn't a new conversation. I mean, from a planning perspective, it goes back 55 years to 1965. But in the 1960s, when you had people like Paul Davidoff and Norman Krumholtz focusing on these issues, often they were just one-offs in the sense that they were focusing on these issues in their respective communities or jurisdictions. But in the 1990s, you had a lot of citizen-level interests, some in the form of the environmental justice movement, but also when Angela Glover Blackwell became the president of PolicyLink, continuing that trend of making sure that we work specifically with the citizens who could be impacted the most in order to make sure that we build a movement around these issues that would be scaled up. And so as a result of that long-term campaigning and sustaining this conversation over time, we've been able to reach a point where more practitioners, whether they be planners, whether they be architects, whether they be developers, are now realizing that they have to take this issue seriously. So in other words, this isn't an issue that just went away. It didn't go away in the 1960s. Instead, it has demonstrated the fact that it has staying power. And as groups like PolicyLink have national conferences that really convene, in some instances, as many as 4,000 attendees, it's demonstrated there's a strong level of legitimacy as well as a pent-up level of demand that architects, planners, and developers need to respond to. And so I think that level of grassroots interest in terms of keeping this issue alive, because we weren't necessarily seeing the level of responsiveness from professionals or from practitioners, is what's really making the difference in terms of this work.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Carlton, for sharing that. Pour l'instant, nous allons continuer cette belle soirée avec Ingrid Waldron. Nous allons passer au côté social qui vraiment se concentrera sur l'expérience afro-néo-écossaise pour être capable de comprendre un petit peu mieux les termes de développement qui se sont produits dans l'Est du Canada. Alors là-dessus, I will actually leave Ingrid take the mic in order to be able to share her with the audience. Ingrid, up to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me, and particularly to the National Capital Commission. Great. Okay, I'm not seeing my PowerPoint. If I'm not seeing my PowerPoint. Okay, great. Okay, next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the work I've been doing with African Nova Scotian communities around various planning issues, specifically focused on environmental racism, climate change, and gentrification since around 2009. And I'm going to use the term spatial violence to kind of articulate some of the harms that have been meted out to this community through policies around public infrastructure inequalities. So from public infrastructure inequalities to gentrification, climate change, and environmental racism, the legacy of spatial violence in African Nova Scotian communities has come to characterize some of the most enduring harms that African Nova Scotians have been subjected to in the spaces and places where they live, work, and play. So as I said, I'm using the term spatial violence to refer to the ways in which Black and other racialized people are harmed by state-sanctioned forms of violence or policies, as well as the absence of policies that enable environmental racism, public infrastructure inequalities, gentrification, and the disproportionate impacts of climate change on racialized communities. So in this presentation, I examined the relationship then between race, space, place, and health to highlight how these issues impact health and well-being in African Nova Scotian communities, particularly community health. Next slide, please. So African Nova Scotians, a lot of people don't know a lot about African Nova Scotians, but they're the oldest Black community in Canada. They've been in Canada for over 300 years, and they are descendants of African slaves and freedmen, Black loyalists from the United States, the Nova Scotian colonists of Sierra Leone, the Maroons from Jamaica, and refugees from the War of 1812. And the majority of African Nova Scotians live in rural, isolated, and out-of-the-way places. There are about 52 what we call historic African Nova Scotian communities, and most of them are living in rural environments. There's one community that I'll talk about later that they reside in an urban environment. But of course, living in isolated rural environment comes with many barriers and challenges for communities on top of issues related to poverty and environmental degradation. Next slide. So spatial forms of violence, of the kind that I mentioned earlier, not only pinpoint some of the long-standing structural inequities that have been enabled by provincial and municipal policies, as I said earlier, as well as the absence of policies, they also highlight how the pursuit of profit has ultimately led to possession dispossession, and the displacement of African Nova Scotian communities. So I kind of refer to a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, that's George Lipschitz, who talks about the racialization of space, to refer to how racism and other social inequalities are imbued within the spaces and places where we live, work, and play, and are spatialized across urban and rural landscapes. Also, Katherine McKittrick, who teaches at Queen's University here in Canada, uses the concept of herbicide to characterize the ongoing destruction of a Black sense of place in the Americas through environmental, social, and infrastructural deterioration. Next slide. For African Nova Scotian communities, then, some of the consequences of public infrastructure decisions include zoning bylaws that are often used to restrict development in African Nova Scotian communities, and in many cases have shrunk community boundaries in Lucasville, which is one African Nova Scotian community, a historic African Nova Scotian community, has resulted in the reliance on well water in South Shelburne, another African Nova Scotian community, which has been dealing with contaminated water for decades. It has resulted in inaccessible and unreliable transportation in East Preston, and poor road maintenance and limited opening hours in the recreation center in North Preston. So these are some examples of how public infrastructure inequalities are played out in rural and isolated African Nova Scotian communities. Next slide. And there are several studies in Canada that have examined the health impacts of public infrastructure inequalities. And they note that the natural outdoor environment has beneficial impacts on health. So when there's an absence of, for example, green space, vegetation, etc., they cause harm in many ways in terms of health. But access to greenness, it has been found, has reduced or does reduce all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease incidence, and respiratory disease mortality, stroke, as well as adverse birth outcomes. Next slide. Spatial violence also manifests in what we call neighborhood revitalization or urban renewal projects that have gentrified low-income and mostly racialized community. And that has happened in the north end of Halifax, which is, I would say, the only urban community that's a historical African Nova Scotian community. And they've been dealing with gentrification for about 15 years. And gentrification has been discussed by a scholar by the name of Sibley. He referred to gentrification as an example of geographies of exclusion. And it includes the lack of representation of racialized and low-income communities in, for example, new businesses in their neighborhoods. Access to resources are often challenging in these communities, lack of affordable housing, and consequently, for the North End and for African Nova Scotians in the North End, the pushing out and displacement of long-term African Nova Scotian residents who have long called, in this case, the North End home for decades. Next slide. Another example of place-based inequality that results from public policy is climate change. And many people often say that we are all impacted by climate change, which is true. It is the case that we are all impacted, but our experiences of climate change and the impacts of climate change will certainly be determined by our race, our social class, disability, and where we live. For African Nova Scotians and other racialized communities, then, they experience triple jeopardy from the climate crisis due to race, class, and residence in primarily rural areas because they are disproportionately exposed to environmental pollutants from nearby industry and reside in places where they are more likely to be impacted by floods, intense heat waves, frequent and heavy rainfall, and higher rates of climate-related disease. In Nova Scotia, sea level rise is a main concern. Over the next 100 years, sea levels are projected to increase tens of centimeters and possibly up to more than a meter. This is a particular concern in African Nova Scotian communities, but also has the potential to damage the heritage site of Fricville, which is a former African Nova Scotian community that was raised in the late 1960s. Next slide. And finally, environmental racism is another place-based issue, another example of how public infrastructure planning policies has failed some of the most vulnerable communities in Nova Scotia, including African Nova Scotians. This is James Desmond, who I met in 2013 when I was conducting some workshops on environmental racism. And he defines environmental racism very succinctly. He says the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian Native and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. So what he's talking about is disproportionality. Those communities that tend to be located disproportionately near to industry and other environmental harms are those who are racialized and low income. It can also include certainly low income white communities that are in rural, isolated places. And we know that there are health risks associated with environmental racism, including respiratory disease, different types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and reproductive illnesses like reproductive cancers. Next slide. I talked earlier about the North End. Many of the African Nova Scotian people who are in the North End today are former residents of Fricville, and I think I talked briefly about the raising of Fricville. So there are various cases of environmental racism in Nova Scotia, and Fricville is a historic case. It's both an example of urban revitalization, urban renewal, gentrification, and environmental racism. So in the 1960s, this community was raised, resulting in the expropriation and displacement of the Black community to other areas of Halifax. But in the wake of industrial development, was left various environmental hazards, such as a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Next slide. Lincolnville is a community I've been working with since 2012, and you saw a photo of James Desmond earlier. This is his community. In 1974 and 2006, a first and second generation landfill was placed in that community, and that community would say that increasing rates of cancer over the years is a direct result of both landfills. Next slide. And I've also been working with Shelburne, the African Nova Scotian community in Shelburne. They have 2 concerns. One concern is the dump that has been in that community since 1943. It was closed in 2016, but they're still concerned about the health burdens or the health risks associated from that landfill. But they're also concerned about well water. They are on well water. They've never been on town or municipal water. The white community in the North End have always been on municipal water, but the Black community in the South End has never been on well water. So of course, well water tends to be more contaminated. So that's another public infrastructure inequality in addition to environmental racism that is of concern to this community. Next slide. So over the past, I would say 8 years, I've been trying to find different ways to address many of these public infrastructure environmental concerns through the Enrich project. That's the project that I started. The full name is the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequity, and Community Health Projects. And I've been trying to address or find solutions to these issues in many ways. Next slide. And one would be simply to create awareness in the community, particularly around environmental racism. When I started the project, the question I got often was, what is environmental racism? And there was a lot of doubt about the reality of environmental racism in Nova Scotia. They wanted proof. So I continue to do a lot of public awareness or awareness raising events where I'm sharing information on the issue using panels, people from different sectors, whether they be community activists or politicians, etc., to raise awareness about this issue and to maybe foster a sense of empathy around the issue so that people want to act on the issue. Next slide. Also, writing is also important. Of course, I'm an academic, and providing proof, I guess, or documenting data is really important, particularly for policymakers in the Department of Environment, but also in planning. This is a book that I wrote that was published in 2018, and it provides insight into the journey and the challenges that I've experienced conducting this project, but it also documents the history of kind of grassroots organizing that Indigenous and Black communities have been engaged in, because certainly I do the work that I do on their backs, right? I just started doing this work in 2012, but they've been trying to address this issue for decades. So I talk a little bit about their journeys, but I also provide some recommendations with respect to how I think this particular issue should be addressed. Next slide. Health is also, I talked about health throughout this presentation, and my research, I found it very important to provide my research to Nova Scotia Health Authority, the kind of main health body in Nova Scotia, and they've used my research for various initiatives. This is the Nova Scotia Brotherhood. This was set up specifically for Black men in Nova Scotia to deal with their various health issues. We know that men in general tend to visit their doctors less than women do, but Black men, even less than other men, I would say. It's intimidating to talk about your health issues, and Black men seem to underutilize health services more than others. So this is kind of a safe space for Black men to talk about mental health issues, but also physical health issues. So the work that I did on gentrification in the north end of Halifax that I discussed earlier, that report that I wrote was used partly to set up this health service for Black men in 2013. Next slide. This is a placemaking project in the north end. So this is also an outcome of the research and report that I wrote. One of the concerns brought forward by the African Nova Scotian community is that in addition to us feeling displaced and pushed out from our community because of gentrification, we want a sense of identity. We want a sense of place. And this placemaking project was led by the African Nova Scotian community. It had two objectives. It was to slow down traffic initially, because there was an intersection that was extremely busy. As children were going to school in the morning, they were kind of dealing with traffic that was, fast moving traffic. So that was one of the reasons why this was done. But the other reason was to give the Black community a sense of place. So this was one of the recommendations that came out of my report, which is kind of a visible manifestation of the identity of the historic Black community in the North End. Next slide. I also founded an NGO called Rural Water Watch. So I met with a geologist at one of my events, and he said, I loved your event, but what are you doing in a tangible way to help these communities? And of course, environmental scientists are very tangible. I'm a sociologist, so sometimes, we think in our heads and it's pie in the sky and it's theory. And he was like, your event was wonderful, but what are you doing to help these communities? I was a bit insulted because I thought, well, I'm doing so many things and now you're insulting me. And then I said, Ingrid, just listen to him. So I listened, and he said, why don't we do a water testing project? And I said, well, I'm a sociologist. What would I know about that? He said, well, I'm a geologist and I want to help. So we created a working group to test water in Lincolnville. So I showed you the photo of James Desmond earlier in his community. And our purpose was to test their water, but also to show the community how to test their own water, because this is community-based community development. So we wanted them to feel empowered to be able to test their own water. Most of us don't know how to do that. We also trained environmental science students to test water. We wrote a report on the results. We went back to the community, shared the results, talked to them about how they needed to manage their drinking water sources, and also how to manage their wells, their unhealthy wells, because an unhealthy well could lead to health problems. And then we said, this really worked well. Let's form an NGO. Let's use that as a blueprint to form an NGO. So we formed this NGO in 2017 as a non-governmental organization, but we only got charitable status about 4 months ago. And we've expanded our work to do annual Healthy Wells Day, which we did on October 18th, to do that in person by collecting water samples from community members who have concerns about water contamination, but also to do a lot of stuff online to raise awareness about the need to keep your well healthy, by sending out infographics on social media. Next slide. I also partnered with EcoJustice. This is a Canadian law charity with offices in different cities in Canada, because a lot of the communities mentioned to me that they want legal remedies. For example, Lincolnville said, we want to launch a class action lawsuit because we lost from the placement of that landfill in our community. We lost jobs, people moved out of our community, people don't want to live here, people don't want to build houses, they don't want to open businesses, so we feel we've lost out. So EcoJustice is currently working with some of the communities I'm working with to identify legal remedies, whether it be a class action lawsuit or private prosecution. Next slide. I'm also working with Let's Sprout, because what I recognized early on is that the root of the problem, particularly with respect to environmental racism, is the fact that our leaders, people in government, people in power, really don't have the right critical analysis, and I would say the sociological analysis, to understand how environmental racism manifests. So I paired up with this non-governmental organization called Let's Sprout to look at how we can embed environmental racism and other place-based issues within the high school and middle school curricula in Nova Scotia. We did do an environmental scan, and we found that this information is not being taught by teachers. Just like racism isn't really being taught, because the teachers here are mostly white and they're intimidated to talk about racism, which I understand. So part of the work that we're doing is to find creative, innovative online tools for teachers to use in the classroom to teach about environmental racism and the histories of Black and Indigenous communities. But in the long term, to transform the curricula, which we know is going to be extremely difficult, maybe impossible at this point. But in addition to that, to make teachers, primarily white teachers, much more comfortable talking about issues of race and environmental racism. So that project is ongoing. Next slide. I've also paired up with Climate Action Services. I have to admit that I haven't done much on climate change. You know, it took a long time for me to get my head wrapped around environmental racism, because it wasn't my doctoral work or my postdoc work. But I'm trying to get much more into climate change. So I've paired up with retired climate change experts to conduct workshops in the African Nova Scotian community. What I found in Nova Scotia is that the Black community, they're not that engaged in climate change issues because they don't see the immediacy of it. I would say that's the case for all of us, but I would say that they would say that, you know, we have other issues to deal with, like police violence and putting food on the table. I don't understand what climate change has to do with me. Right? So that's a general sentiment. So how do we make them care? Because they love their community. So how do we make them care about climate change? So the first step is to conduct workshops in the community to get a sense of their priorities. So I'm working with them. Hopefully I'm working with them because we just put a grant application in. I feel very good about it. And if we get the grant, then we're going to start this work immediately. Next slide. I also train students, of course. I'm a professor, but what I found very thrilling about the work that I do is that the issues that I discussed tonight are so interdisciplinary. And what I don't like is the fact that many of us are in our silos. What I found is that environmental racism and all the issues I've talked about have been of interest to faculty and students in geography, in sociology, in environmental science, in planning, in health, in medicine, in political science, in the School of Law. I've had students from all of those disciplines, and faculty in most of those disciplines work with me on these issues. So for me, the solution to many of these issues are interdisciplinary. So what I would love to see is more of us transcending our silos and working together to solve some of these problems, because these problems are interdisciplinary problems. Next slide. I use media a lot, social media a lot, and interviews on television, in print, etc., in order to get the word out. This is another kind of awareness raising approach to educate people on the issues, but also to get people to empathize a bit so they can act on it. Next slide. And one of those kind of media approaches was my film. It's currently on Netflix, called There's Something in the Water. Nova Scotia-born actress Ellen Page reached out to me on Twitter in late 2018, and she said she wanted to use her celebrity or her platform to help me to raise awareness about the issues, to support the Indigenous and Black individuals involved in this issue, but also to get the word out about my project. We connected, we decided on a film. It went to the Toronto International Film Festival in September of 2019, and then March of this year, it started streaming on Netflix. I don't have enough time to talk about the benefits of this particular film and what it has done since then in terms of resolving many of the issues I discussed today. But yeah, film is powerful. There's no doubt about it. But most of all, I would say that this film has inspired people. And when you get people who are inspired, who reach out to me on email, you know that maybe at some point they're going to act. Maybe they're not going to act today, but they are going to act in the future because they felt so inspired by women in the film who have no political clout and no economic clout, but are doing big things in their communities despite the fact that they don't have clout in those ways. Next slide. This is us at the Toronto International Film Festival with Ellen sitting down. We walked the red carpet. It was fun, but most of all, we got to do more knowledge mobilization, right? Featured in Time magazine, Rolling Stone magazine, all the kind of magazines that I read. We got the word out more broadly to the United States as well. I was very surprised that people in the United States had never heard of the term environmental racism because it was a term that originated in the United States in the mid-1980s. So, you know, just creating more awareness about the project in Canada, but worldwide in the United States was, for me, crucial for this work. Next slide. And I talked about Netflix. Next slide. This is a bill. So I think a missing piece of the puzzle is legislation. In 2015, I worked with Lenore Zan, who you see on screen, originally from Australia, but has been in Nova Scotia for quite some time. And we worked on Bill 111. The Act to Address Environmental Racism, and it went to second reading, but it never turned into legislation. And she tried over the years to get it into legislation, never happened. Earlier this year, just before COVID hit, and COVID hit Canada March 15th, she said, why don't we refashion that 2015 bill and turn it into a federal bill? We can address environmental racism across Canada. I said, yes, that's even better. It's better than a provincial bill. And she did that, and she introduced it February 26th of this year, and then COVID hit because we had immediate plans to put it forward to second reading, and then COVID hit. So I said to her, what now? She said, well, perhaps in the fall. I spoke with her 4 weeks ago, and she said, Ingrid, we are putting it forward to second reading on December 3rd of this year. So I'm now involved in a campaign. It's been very tiring to get attention from the media and from MPs or politicians to support this bill. So hopefully if this bill continues on to third reading and fourth reading, and I'm not sure how many readings, and then eventually turns into legislation, it could help address some of the issues I talked about tonight. Next slide. I'm also part of a new national anti-environmental racism coalition with a partner in Toronto. I've always wanted the Enrich project to go broad, beyond Nova Scotia. How do I address environmental racism and other place-based issues? So climate change, inequality, policing against Black people, violence against Black people, all of the social issues that we are seeing today. How do we deal with it? So we decided to forge this new national coalition with partners. We have our first meeting December 16th, and we're connected with Makeway, which is a charitable organization that would do the fundraising for us. So they're raising funds right now to get this coalition going. So I'm very excited about this because it's an opportunity to address the issues nationwide. Next slide. And finally, I'm also working on environmental rights. Canada is a country that has yet to secure the legal right to a healthy environment. Many countries around the world have a legal right to a healthy environment. We don't. So I am part of this new network with individuals from different sectors to see how we can do that. How can we get the attention of our Prime Minister? This issue has been put forward to him many times, but he's ignored it. So what do we need to do now? We just recently today released an op-ed directed at him, and we're planning to do other actions in order to get his attention to ensure that finally we get in Canada a legal right to a healthy environment. So those are some of the activities I've been engaged in to look at various issues of spatial violence, place-based inequalities in Nova Scotia. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for sharing not only the information, but also the variety of projects that you are leading. And at the same time, being able to see how they are evoking change and how the way to move forward is to be able to actually have significant change in order to be able to really have the communities really being able to focus on their health as well as their well-being as projects on development move forward, because there's always going to be development that will happen, and the types of development will differ. But I think that your work is impeccable into actually reaching those communities toward making sure that it is appropriate. And it is also the fact of being able to focus on a community-based approach rather than just the developer type of paternalistic way of developing. Mm-hmm. One question I think that I would like to ask is, you used the terms spatial violence and herbicide in your presentation. And I wanted to know, how do you think people can understand these terms? But at the same time, how do they change?
The impacts of public policy, and specifically environmental policy, lead to herbicide. So when Katherine McKittrick at Queen's University discusses herbicide, she's characterizing, as she said, the ongoing destruction of place in Black communities, specifically in Canada, that have been subjected to colonialism. So one example of that, of course, is the razing of Fricville, for example, or what's happening now in the north end of Halifax that has displaced African Nova Scotians who have called the north end their home. Another example is the propensity to locate polluting industries, waste dumps, landfills in African Nova Scotian communities. So the way I describe it is that the inequalities, the place-based inequalities that we see that harm, for example, Black communities on the ground, are simply outcomes of policies, harmful policies, whether they be intended or unintended. And it starts with the policymaker, who's typically from a particular social class and a particular racial group. And that person often is unaware of how policies harm, because we all navigate our worlds within our particular social identities. So I never say that those public policies or environmental policies are purposeful in every single case, but they are harmful, because what's missing is often the perspectives of the people who are most impacted and affected on those regulatory boards or commissions or NGOs. We don't often get the opportunity to hear how these decisions are impacting them. So when I think of the full gamut of spatial violence and herbicide, I'm thinking about where it starts from. It starts from the policymaker, the decision maker, the assessment tools that you use, like an environmental assessment, and then later on the spatial clustering, for example, of industries in certain communities that harm people. And all of this happens subtly. It's an example of institutional racism, right? Where it's not often direct, but it happens subtly and it weaves itself into policies. And then what happens is, in many ways, destruction of communities, as we've seen in Fricville that was razed, and the North End, African Nova Scotian communities today in the North End.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for sharing that. Really appreciate it. In our timing right now, nous allons continuer maintenant d'une côte de l'Est à la côte ouest de notre pays, en prenant l'opportunité d'écouter Katherine avec sa présentation, qui est la réponse intégrée de Van Clay à la justice environnementale. This is taking the side from the West Coast as we welcome Katherine Howard to be able to share her thoughts on her presentation and be able to give us a different side of the planning portion of environmental justice as she looks into how this master plan actually came to being. So I pass the mic to you, Katherine, to be able to share your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share some of VAMPLAY with you. I'm going to focus on some of the ways we incorporated equity in this very long-range, high-level planning tool. And the idea is that it impacts everyday decision-making undertaken by one government authority. So I wanted to start with a statement of very much thanks to Ingrid and Carlton for setting up the scene for this so beautifully. What a fantastic way to start. And I also wanted to mention that this work really focuses on equitable access to green space. And of course, that is, as we've just heard, only one very small pillar of environmental justice. But when you think about it from a planning and urban form perspective, it's pretty integral to the way that cities operate and the way that we make decisions in a very colonial mindset. So in that way, it's quite powerful. The work that I'm going to present tonight is a method that really can be adapted to help lots of organizations reach all manner of ideas and goals for the future because it's a prioritization tool. So really whatever matters to you can be really embedded effectively if you have the right planning tool to use. And so I encourage you to think about the way that I'm presenting this and approach it with some flexibility and adaptability in mind because it's actually very adaptable. And of course, this is one very small piece of the complex puzzle that we've already heard quite a lot about tonight. So on to the next slide. I am the project manager for VAMPLAY, which is our brand new, only approved last year, the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation Services Master Plan. It is not a land use plan, but really a decision-making guide. The idea is that it sets up a selection of priorities and policies and tools which help the pursuit of equity, connectivity, and access to parks and recreation for all. I would encourage you, if you're interested in the rest of this document, our series of documents, actually, it's 5 different documents. You can check it out at vancouver.ca/VAMPLAY. And look, if there's any questions and ideas that come out of this that we don't get to tonight that perhaps relate to the other aspects of VAMPLAY, please feel free to reach out and chat to me about it. I'm actually really interested in the ideas that it generates for you. A lot of the work we did was really to start imagining the future of parks and recreation. And so the idea, a lot of it is to stimulate your imagination. So the next slide, I'm just going to give some acknowledgements. So the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation is one board which is associated with the City of Vancouver. We worked with the consultant firm called Design Workshop, who is the lead consultant for this work based in Denver, Colorado. And a lot of the mapping work we did was conducted by Licker Geospatial. I want to also make a very special acknowledgement that this work takes place on and really deeply impacts the beautiful and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I'm very humbled to be able to contribute in this very small way to the ongoing journey that we're on towards a decolonised and less harmfully inequitable future for the City of Vancouver. So the next slide, please. What to address? So there's many, many different ways, especially when you're starting on a long-range planning tool, to consider how you're going to make the biggest impact on equity/inequities. And I would encourage you to deeply understand the system, and especially the decision-making systems and power structures going on in the organisation that's contributing to the inequitable outputs and outcomes that have experienced over time. So what you can do to determine the right tool for you that you're going to create in order to affect change is to deeply understand the system. And asking these questions is a great way to start unraveling some of that and to understand how history has shaped the city or the issue that you're seeing on the ground. And without this knowledge, it's really hard to upset any kind of status quo. You need to know what you're dealing with. I've adapted these questions from a set of what we call the questions for decolonial interrogation that were created by our reconciliation planner, Rena Suter, which are in the VAMPLAY framework. If you're interested in more information about this, it's actually a fantastic tool that's very useful in day-to-day decision-making to have a more decolonial view of how decisions are being made, especially in government. So I'm going to take you on a short journey of understanding the system and what we use to create this priority setting tool. So next slide, please. So we have a whole series of goals and targets many city governments do. One of them, which was set in 2010's Greener City Action Plan, was a goal for all residents to be a 5-minute walk from a park or green space. And on the surface, that sounds incredible. It's equality. Everyone, no matter where you live in the city, has easy, walkable access to something green. And it is wonderful, no doubt, it absolutely is. But I invite you to consider what this kind of target means for planning and what it really means for equity and fairness. And I just wanted to reiterate that it's important to notice the difference between equality, everyone, having benefit from the same level of support, and equity, where everyone receives the support that they need in order to enjoy equal benefits. For example, some neighbourhoods will need more park space than others to have the same feeling of access. This map you can see here shows walking time to the nearest park. And you can see the dark purple areas, especially in the southwest of the city, where if we were to use this map as a priority setting tool, that's where we would focus our efforts. That's where we'd go and buy new parkland or spend money making a park more beautiful. And I'm going to take you through a little bit more information so you can see why maybe that's not the best idea. So next slide, please. This map adds a little bit more complexity to the story. It shows park provision and population density. So each hexagon, the colour indicates how far away your nearest park is, but also how many people you share that park with. And as you can see, this represents a slightly more fair option as a priority setting tool, and you can see that the pattern changed significantly. Next slide, please. And another layer for your consideration, housing form. Does fairness in park provision need to consider if people have access to private outdoor space or a backyard? I would say now more than ever in the pandemic, we're super aware of the availability of fresh air and green space, open space, not only close to home, but at home. Those of us, like myself, living in small downtown apartments, we've always treated park space like a living room where we go and exercise and meet friends and stretch our legs. And that is so apparent now how valuable that is, and how glad I am that I have a very small balcony to spend some time on these days. So I would argue that an equitable approach to making decisions about where park space is should consider housing form. So as you can see here in the light blue, that is predominantly a single family neighbourhoods. And over to the west side of the city, you have much larger lot sizes as well, which are not shown on this graph, but that is also true. Next slide, please. This map shows you a little bit more about the city, and you may not know too much about Vancouver. So I wanted to include this one, not because that's where we're going to focus our effort, but it tells you a lot about the system. And it's patterns like this, especially when you consider it from a perspective of barriers to access to services, that we need to think about all of the patterns going on in the city. And of course, income is just one factor which affects an individual's ability to access services, not limited to recreation services. But regardless, this map shows a really dynamic pattern and dramatic pattern. And as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, it's patterns like this that we need to see and pique our interest and go, what's going on here? Why is this the way it is? And how do we unpack this a little bit and disrupt it so that this pattern doesn't keep continuing? So next slide, please. Now, Vancouver is not alone in this challenge. This complex city is a product of its upbringing, and due to the patterns of colonial development and investment over the history of the city, distribution of everything from parks to land use to transit to infrastructure, lot sizes, all of that is very uneven. And it always has been. But also, these patterns have always been tightly tied to class, race, gender, and other systems of power. And consequently, the conditions of social and environmental injustice persist. And as the city gets more dense and more unaffordable, it reinforces those patterns. Okay, next slide, please. So when we began to examine the city through this lens, it became very apparent that there are some patterns of inherent privilege in access to parks and recreation held by some populations. And it really opened up the opportunity for us to start disrupting that. And really, this is a case of the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you know your local politician, if you're active in the community because you've got time and energy to do that work, you end up with the better parks. You end up with the new community centre. You rally together to get the nice things. You have the larger lot sizes with the bigger trees, and it's a much more, beautiful place to live because you've got that power in the community. And it was clear that, that pattern was just getting worse and worse and worse. And areas of the city that were on the fringe during various stages of the development or were in busy port areas, that they were subject to poor air quality, water quality, and were least desirable and received the least attention, which over time, decision-making favoured those with this power and voice that I was mentioning, and that the spatial inequalities just kept on being reinforced. So next slide, please. So the approach that we presented in VAMPLAY is a citywide master plan level tool that's targeted to upset those patterns. And it's really important to remember that because equity is a very complex topic, as we've heard a little bit about tonight and as you would understand. So a master plan level tool is not really the right one to address deep issues of personal feelings of equity or inequity or sense of welcome, for example. But this is one tool that helps unravel some of that and provides some momentum for that movement. So what it does is it works by taking ownership of the inequitable manner in which services were provided in the past and by identifying those historically underserved areas of the city. Secondarily, tripping over my words, it directs resources to those areas so that these inequities can be addressed in a really inclusive way with community. So it supports local action. So mapping tools are really useful and really people have a great affinity with maps. It draws people's attention. Decision makers love them. You can tell really complex stories in a powerful, engaging way with a really well-produced map. But of course, it's just one way and the policy needs to follow. But I would encourage you to think of this as a way that is a really visually interesting, easy to communicate way to affect decision making and tell a really important story. Okay, so next slide, please. We'll show you the Equity Initiative Zone. So this map shows areas of the city that we are calling historically underserved. So having seen some of the patterns that I've shown you earlier in the city, you'll recognise some similarities here. Now, geographic tools like this are not completely uncommon. New York, San Francisco and Boston have similar maps, but this one's a little bit unique in that it focuses particularly on access to parks and recreation, and it's structured around the acknowledgement of systemic prejudice and inequity in the planning for those spaces. It takes ownership of that. This spatial inequity has direct impacts on residents' access to opportunities, but also access to services, health, well-being, social capital, community development, economic development, and all of that has those health impacts that Ingrid was talking about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we created this in the next slide. We used 3 factors to create this composite map. They've really focused on gaps in service provision as opposed to the need experienced by the community. And as I've just said, that means that the Park Board is highlighting where inequities are caused by the way decisions were made in the past. The first indicator is park access gaps, and this is that hexagon map that you saw earlier. So how much park space and how many people you share that with, taking acknowledgement of population density. The second indicator is low barrier access to recreation. And this map shows areas of the city where there is highest demand for the Park Board's low barrier recreation program. And what this means is it's measuring perceived access to recreation opportunity and where people have put their hand up and said, we need lower barrier access to recreation. And it's really the first place to look to put emphasis on that. And the third one is urban forest canopy cover, and this was done using LiDAR data, and it highlights areas of the city that have lower urban forest canopy cover. And what's great about that is that it offsets private open space, open green space in backyards. So it highlights that problem, but also street trees and park trees, and has a great proxy for urban quality living environment, including urban heat impacts, water and air quality. Okay, the next, I'm just going to drop back onto the slide here and just remind you again, this again is just one way of prioritizing effort. And in the next slide, you'll see an example of how we're using it. So these dots show where over the last year, the Park Board has put capital funds. Now, capital planning is actually a really powerful way to influence equity outcomes. It's one of the biggest moments where you can have an impact within government. So where we put our money is where we put our mouth. That's how we get things done, and prioritizing that money spend is critical. And this is one of the biggest decisions that we make as an organisation. So this is just the last year, and some of them were obviously in progress before VAMPLAY, but also some spending is tied to developer contributions. So the capital funds need to go to where those developments are. So some of them can't be prioritised using this, but most can. The next slide. I wanted to remind us that maps are really powerful representations that reveal these patterns, spatial patterns and processes of social and environmental phenomenon. But the intention is that this work is the start of great conversations, that we start telling the story and inspiring action. So it's really about this next step, is where we actually hit the ground in terms of equity. We want to address inequities in an inclusive way that's driven by community. And to do that, we're layering on what we're calling equity analysis factors, which will help us ask better questions, get the right people in the room for discussion, talk about new and different patterns that are emerging as a result of this work. And we're going to work with partners, equity-seeking groups, and others on these equity analysis factors so that the community is directly involved in the data gathering process and, importantly, the interpretation of that data. It's going to be a very involved process over time. So some of the equity analysis factors will directly help with decision making, but as you can see here, the one that's clicked on is the growth areas. And this is actually really interesting because one of the reasons, like I mentioned just in the last slide, why capital projects can't be located in equity initiative zones is that they're funded by development. And areas seeing lots of development are often those the ones that are changing a lot, but also seeing lots of new investment, which is fantastic for those new communities, but doesn't help us address aging infrastructure, for example. So as you can see, there's more patterns and more interesting conversations that can emerge out of a tool like this. The next slide is an example of another equity analysis factor that we're working on that I thought was an interesting one to bring up. This one we're calling restorative natural areas, showing areas of the city where people might feel more connected with nature. We'll see, that map's terrible and you can't see it exactly, but the next slide will show you the indicators that are going into that restorative natural areas index. And it's just an example of some amazing flexibility that's possible with this approach. This work was done recently by Joanne Fitzgibbons, and it just starts some really great conversations about equity and nature-based solutions. The next slide gives you this is another major piece of VAMPLAY is this connectivity vision. And one way to implement both the restorative natural areas piece, but also access to parks and recreation citywide is through connectivity. And I wanted to bring up interesting point that there's emerging evidence that's suggesting that linear parks and greenways perhaps may have a less of a negative impact on community displacement and gentrification. They're a bit of a light touch approach sometimes, so we're investigating some of that and also creating this integrated feel of parks and recreation throughout the city, which has active transportation, connected ecologies, water use, everything all kind of woven in together. The next slide, please. I just wanted to remind us that this was just one piece of everything VAMPLAY. This is the framework here. So you can see that delivering services equitably is one major component of our master plan. But there's two others. And if you're interested in setting targets for assets, for example, in the Welcome Everyone section, or that more integrated connectivity piece in Weave the City Together, please dive into Vanplay and take a look at that a little bit deeper. And the last slide is a recap. So thank you very much. I'm more than happy to answer some questions.
Thank you so very much, Katherine, for sharing the goals and objectives of Vanplay and how all of it actually comes together. I think one first question is really toward the outreach that actually was possible through Vanplay. There have been various master plans that have taken upon themselves to have their professionals from city, county, any type of level to go into these communities toward being able to really have an outreach program that encompasses them within the framework of the master plan. How has Vanplay looked at the demand of marginalized populations that are basically those less involved in consultations and discussions for the objectives of master in general?
That, I mean, is a really interesting question, actually, and I would say that it was tough, not because of our lack of interest, but because a citywide master plan is not the most engaging project for people to get involved in, especially as it took us almost 4 years to create. So it's one of these things that we were lucky to have some incredibly diligent, committed stakeholders and community representatives engage with us throughout the whole process. And we did have moments of deep connection with especially equity-seeking groups in our community. But however, the big moves, especially with these structural changes to the organization's way of making decisions, is the hard work that the master plan needed to do to enable and activate that action on the ground at a later date with the funding ready and the relationships ready and the building that's not falling down and that's got the emphasis that it needs and it's got the ear of political decision makers and all of those things are kind of ready. So I like to think of it almost as like getting the ground ready for all of that, and that was my role in equity in this piece. And in order to get to this result, we worked very closely with our community centre associations. So these are not-for-profit organisations that run our community centres on behalf of the Park Board. And they're fantastic because they're engaged. It's their job to represent their local community. Because they're all spread throughout the city. And they held with me throughout the whole 4-year process and was able to say, like, we heard this is going on in our community. We need this, we need that. And we tested some ideas that way. So it's really about that laying the groundwork and getting the bureaucracy out of the way so that action can happen with communities next or as an ongoing thing. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you for sharing, Katherine. So as we basically look at all these different presentations that circle back into the subject of equity and environmental justice, I think that one of the questions that we have for this particular portion of the event really evolves around the idea of policymaking as how a driving force toward creating change. From when we look at the work that all three of you have actually been able to complete and continue and encourage, there's a link that basically is pretty set within how policy comes in to play toward creating change. I will swing the first response to Carlton as far as being able to see what do you think as a policy making document or initiative has played a greater role into how communities like Bayview have been able to continue to develop in a way that has been favorable to their communities?
Sorry, I was on mute. First, thanks for asking that question. And the one thing I always like to share with peers is the fact that, public policy isn't just about rules. It's about priorities and values. And so we have to understand that first is the fact that when we set priorities and values, that often informs, the type of outcome. And so when it comes to, policies that I feel are particularly important in order to advance goals of environmental justice or equity that are really making a difference. So I mentioned it during my presentation is, for example, the type of work that they've managed to do in the state of California, which is to make sure that when you initiate a general planning process, general plans are basically comprehensive plans, is to make sure that they actually include an environmental justice element so that it's no longer something that's done in an ad hoc manner, but instead it's now a requirement. It's going to become a new standard that we have to be mindful of and we have to speak towards as we work in the process of actually, releasing or getting a plan prepared for finalization. Because so often when it comes to issues of social equity or environmental injustice, what we often find is that there's a tendency for there to be a lot of cherry picking, especially when there are certain issues that we may be uncomfortable with. And so from my perspective, persons actually know what the problems are. For example, I often say that within our profession, it's called planning. It's not called accident. And so we can't just take the position that we didn't realize, some of these issues were legitimate issues when the reality is that persons have often been speaking up and raising certain concerns. But because they may not be politically expedient, we often make the decision, well, that's not my responsibility. That's not my purview. But in places like California, they've now made it an actual requirement that there is no longer a choice of opting to, focus on doing something that you would prefer. Instead, you need to actually think more critically, intentionally, and deliberately about how to make sure these issues are going to be reflected in the.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Carlton. Ingrid, and as far as along the same lines, as we look at Bill 111 and how it actually is going to be moved forward, what is the biggest impact that you're awaiting this bill to actually have? Sorry, Ingrid, I think that you're on mute again.
Yeah, I think the main objective is to address environmental racism, longstanding cases of environmental racism, so it doesn't continue to happen. But one of the main objectives would be to ensure that government consults with communities. The thing that ties all the communities together is their concern about the fact that they're never consulted, that industry goes into their community, they're never consulted, or they're consulted in the middle stage of that project, right? Particularly with Indigenous communities who would say, this is our land, and you've come into our communities and you have not asked permission and you haven't consulted with us. So one of the objectives of the bill is consultations with community, which certainly I've done through the research that I've done, and I've gone to government to ask them to do the same, but that's something they're very hesitant to do because that would disrupt a lot of things, right? I mean, this is about profit ultimately. So you're asking them to do something that's extremely challenging because this is about profit. So I'm hoping that there would be more consultations with communities that are affected would be able to give their perspectives and priorities about what concerns them, that people take issues of vulnerability into account, because the communities that are most affected by environmental racism are those same communities that are impacted by the social determinants of health. So when you, for example, locate an industry in their communities, you are further compromising the vulnerabilities that already exist in those communities. So I would like government to have a much more critical lens of how environmental racism manifests and how it impacts communities. But I would also like the tool that's used to assess where an industry should be placed to change. So the environmental assessment is one of the tools, as you know, that's used to decide where a particular industry gets placed. And what I mentioned in my book is that we need a social science perspective incorporated into that. Typically, it's environmental scientists who are kind of leading the charge on environmental assessments, and they're thinking about the best place to put it, but they're not thinking about vulnerability. They're not thinking about the things I talked about the fact that these are communities that are dealing with housing insecurity and food insecurity and poverty and issues of labor, underemployment and unemployment. And apparently there's a project right now at Dalhousie that I've learned about where they're getting together social scientists and sociologists and health people and classic environmental scientists to come together to work on how we can incorporate much more of a social science perspective. I talked earlier about let's do away with our silos, because I think the solutions to many of these problems are interdisciplinary and that we need social scientists just as much as we need environmental scientists. So for me, that's also the key. How can we bring people in different professions, different sectors together to find solutions? And this bill engages with that idea, right? That we need to come together and build bridges in order to hear different perspectives. So yeah, I'm just leading this campaign to make this happen. We'll see what happens. It's been a long road since 2015.
No, but everything that serves a purpose is incremental in its own way. So we're really looking forward to seeing how this bill comes into place, for sure. Along those lines, as far as how Ingrid actually went through these different points, Katherine, you talked and mentioned about the decolonial interrogation that was part of VanPlay. I think that there's always an idea when it comes to master plan that it's always looked upon as a top-down approach toward developing various areas, cities, counties. How has VanPlay actually been able to really get itself within a more of a community-based consensus building type of approach toward it being the type of document that reflects all communities within Vancouver?
I might say that it doesn't do that, actually. Like, I think that it's on the journey towards that, but it doesn't necessarily do that, and for good reason, in that we really wanted to get our house in order first. We were incredibly aware of, especially planning, as being fraught. Like it's got some really big problems in the way that it's always been. It's incredibly colonial. It causes harm. The political system that we're operating in does the same. And so we're in this process of starting to unpack some of that from within the organization. And the idea behind it is to take ownership of it and to start getting some stuff sorted out before, and not looking to communities and to our First Nations for help with that, but rather just, guidance, yes, but not like we're going to do the work first. We're going to work out what's going wrong in our organization, start to unpack some of the stuff that's not working, put some better processes in place, and ask the hard questions about how we make decisions and who's in power and how the system works to keep causing this pain, and deal with that first, so that we're going out with a clearing conscience. It's going to take a very, very long time to undo any full extent of the damage, but at least we're taking some steps. We're trying to be a part of the conversation and do the hard work internally first. And I think that was what was really interesting about this master plan project, in that it's so different to any other master plan that I've worked on before, is that it was really internally driven to start solving some of the problems internally first. So I don't think it does. I don't think it does immediately cause an immediate benefit to specific communities, but rather it's like getting the bureaucracy sorted so that, to some extent, so that we can do that work more quickly, more actively, more easily, as a part of everyday embedded decision-making processes. So I don't know whether that answers the question, actually.
I mean, it's a tough question, but it's also a tough. It's a very fine line toward being able to really be equitable in development, and how the process of all these design professions are looking toward developing different areas and seeing what approach actually does work and work appropriately and is suitable to the amenable communities. So it is a hard question, because I think that master planning in general has always been toward looking at how cities, localities, communities, want to shape themselves. And the thing that is always a contradiction at times is shaping themselves is shaping people and shaping environments. And so it has to come together in a way in order to be able to make sense out of being able to what is going to be promoted. So yes, it's a hard question, but it's one that has a huge amount of historical content to it as well. So
I should be really interested in Ingrid's response to this if we said something along the lines of how many times have you been a part of a project with a community that was held up, stopped, enthusiasm dropped because as soon as you started engaging with the city or the provider or the land or something, the bureaucracy caused the delay, and it actually wasn't the drive by the community. Perhaps it was the challenge. I'd imagine you'd have many examples of that.
Probably with the North End project, mostly, maybe not around the environmental racism issue, but in terms of the North End project, when there were a lot of starts and stops in terms of engaging the community, but not doing it correctly, and nothing ever changed. I remember speaking to a planning student who was in my health course, and I said to him, isn't consultation problematic for planners? Because planners really want to do what they want to do. So when you consult and somebody's saying to you, or communities are saying to you, we don't want you to do that, it's not really what you want to hear as a planner, to be honest. I said, is that true? Because I wanted to hear from him, because he's a planning student. He said, yes, right? Because it disrupts your plan. So sometimes I wonder if planners truly want to hear from communities at the get-go, because they're intent on doing certain things in a certain way, and communities disrupt that if they say no, or if they say not that way. So I don't know, maybe that's speaking out of turn, but I wanted him to be honest with me, and he said, you're right. So in the North End, that's what's happened. They've had these consultations since 2009, but nothing ever changed.
Well, I think also one of the things to consider is it depends on the priorities and the values of the individual as a planner. And also planners need to be very sensitive to their own professional code. At least in the United States, when we talk about the ethics of planners, we know we have a responsibility to speak up for people who may not have a voice in the planning process and encourage the alteration of policies that may not meet their needs. For some planners, those are just words. But I think for others, particularly those who self-identify as being progressive planners, they realize that we need to do a better job of cooperation and collaboration with the public and giving deference to local knowledge. But unfortunately, that hasn't always been a corporate value within the planning profession. I mean, even in one of the slides that I shared, there has been this history in the planning profession, particularly when it has been a little bit more conservative, of persons basically saying that we should master the ability to make change of the built environment and just concede that social and economic issues are beyond our purview. Well, that's a choice. And sometimes we've had a lot of responsible parties in their positions of influence trying to drive the conversation in a certain way. And I think it's important for planners who have a value system that more closely aligns with equity to also find ways, one, either to speak up or find ways to have their voice heard in other outlets. And that's been part of the journey that we've been on as practitioners, is finding ways to scale up these messages that normally haven't been given the level of attention that they deserve, because we're working within systems, and systems are made up of people who have agendas and have their own particular preferences. And so it's really become a conversation about priorities and values of different parties, some that more closely align with advancing equity, some that more closely align with advancing making physical improvements to spaces, and some that focus on basically what are the objectives of the economic bottom line. And so this is a conversation that's relevant to sustainability. It's a conversation that's relevant to planning. It's a conversation that's relevant in so many different sectors. But there are certainly planners who do have a clear interest in the necessity of advancing equity, because they realize if we don't make a change, we're simply going to enable the same for another generation. And so we have to be intentional and deliberate about making those necessary changes now and making them a standard part of how we do business rather than the exception.
So for the planners who don't hold those values, do we just wait for them to embrace those values? Because that might not happen. Is there a role that planning schools, I'm thinking of School of Planning at Dalhousie, what role do they play in educating students, graduate students, about the issues we discussed today, about equity issues, so that, you talk about systemic change, that's part of the change. They're not being educated on these issues, how to use an equity lens to inform what they do, because we can't wait for people to have the values. Some are, as you said, are not going to have them. So what is the root of it education?
Well, that's one of the issues we need to correct. When I was the chair of the American Planning Association Social Equity Task Force, we took the time to look very critically at what are the barriers that are limiting planners from developing that equity lens. And one of the challenges is education. When I was a student, our focus on equity conversations only occurred within the span of 2 weeks, within the span of 2 years. And obviously, you're not going to develop a very strong grounding in terms of values that are oriented around advancing equity within that span of time. And so the point was the fact that we acknowledged that one of the critical things that we have to correct is making sure that we immerse students and help them to understand how these type of issues are pragmatic in their approach, that we're not just talking about aspiration, but instead that there is a broad number of solutions that have not been part of the normal dialogue when we teach, and certainly not part of the normal dialogue when we work as practitioners and we educate the public about options and alternatives. Mm-hmm. And so when we don't prepare students in an academic environment, sometimes those students go out into a professional environment that's not prepared to help them to develop their proficiency either. And so you put your finger on one of the very important gaps that need to be corrected, because in many academic environments, academic programs aren't necessarily teaching and exposing students to the full range of different options, especially in terms of advancing equity as a goal. There was an article, I believe, in City Lab magazine a couple years ago that focused on how students at Harvard University within the School of Architecture were frustrated that they weren't learning enough about social equity based on the curriculum. And so the students had to design their own curriculum. And so a lot of it is basically practitioners who have a passion for these issues are now taking the initiative. They're not waiting. They're taking the initiative to affect change themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The other group to educate on this is the political decision makers. So quite often we'll get to a point, even if you're like working with the most groundbreaking planners, you take it up for approval to your elected commissioners, councillors, and if they don't understand the rationale, if all they're exposed to is the loud voices in the community, then it's really hard to say no. It's really hard to be in a place where they can say, yep, I have the information I need to say, no, I'm going to take a firm stance on this. I don't know whether you've seen anything on those lines, Carlton.
Well, I was going to say that there's an academic paper, and I can't think of the name of it, but it actually explored the 3 roles that are common to planners, meaning the planner as politician, the planner as technician, and then the planner is advocate. And so it's designed to be a paper to help readers understand that there are these 3 specific roles that affects the way that practitioners actually do business. And for example, if you're the planner as politician, then you tend to be very politically savvy. You focus on results and outcomes. And, sometimes you make judgments in terms of what's going to be more important, especially when you're considering issues like your own career, your own upward mobility, being responsive to supervisors who are above you. And then you have others who perhaps look at their role more so as being a technician who just simply offers a recommendation, and then we allow the elected officials to make a decision. So it's not your job to push or force a certain decision from your position as a professional, but instead you try to position others to make a more informed decision. But then, of course, there's also the role of planner as the advocate, which basically means we have to speak up when we see something that's wrong. You know, as John Lewis said when he was alive, he said that we have to be willing to get into good trouble, necessary trouble, when we see something that's not fair, not right, or not just. And there are many planners who see themselves as actually being in that role. You know, we work within bureaucracies and within government agencies, and sometimes the issues that affect the most vulnerable populations don't always rise to the top. And so if we're not speaking up about these issues within public institutions, then who else is going to speak about these issues and give them the level of attention that they need so that they can properly be corrected? So again, that paper did a wonderful job in terms of explaining, I guess, the distinctions that do occur in terms of what are the important drivers in terms of how planners look at their own work.
That's fantastic all around. And I think that it also leads to the idea that planners as advocates toward being able to enrich communities through environmental justice really need to take that advocacy tool to be able to really push forward, and not just it being the title of one of our planning manuals that we go through for 2 weeks. So I think that there's a lot that needs to actually that has to happen in order to be able to make sure that planners are advocating for the communities, but at the same time understanding that their level of education is toward that technical assessment of being able to be the point person toward, if there are various ideas that come through, to be the person to kind of lead the way and towards saying, well, we can't do that there because of these particular criteria, or we can do this here because there are possibilities there. And I think that Katherine, the Van Play master plan touches on that, to be able to kind of guide people toward understanding what that actually can come up with, as well as the objectives and the goals of the master plan. One thing that I did want to touch as we come to a close to this fabulous event, one of the ideas and visions that the National Capital Commission really focuses on is the idea of placemaking. And it's the portion of design and of concepts that actually really promote the health and the happiness and the well-being of not only the communities themselves, but the visitors, and enhancing the visitor experience through the various assets that it has within the capital region. All of you have touched a little bit about placemaking within how you've brought your different presentations. Just curious as to is there one element from those particular initiatives that have really pushed placemaking in a way to actually really advocate for the communities as much as possible toward them feeling part of the entire process? I'll focus on Katherine first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, the way that I would say VanPlay does that at this system-wide level, again, it doesn't go into individual locations, but instead what it does is bring up emphasis and attention on areas of the city that have been historically left behind. And the intention behind that is so that when decisions are made, that the light goes to those those places, and that projects, as they bubble up, have an easier path through the bureaucracy, so that they're not held back, and that they don't get overtaken by the new concern from the West Siders who have decided this is what they want to do, and that's fantastic because they've got the momentum and they've got the attention already, just and they can call up their commissioner and say, hey, let's make this happen, and it will. So instead, it's about balancing out those loud voices with the ones that we don't hear from, so that we can encourage those projects to have legs and to make them more sustainable and to get them the resources that they need to be happening on the ground with community, by community, whatever situation works for that particular project. So and really I wanted to thank you for your comments around community engagement in particular, because the training and the way that we do community engagement, sometimes we just hear from the same people over and over. And part of what the VanPlay tool does is balance that out a little bit and brings voices even when we don't get to hear them, that they're there, that it's occurring and it's visible. And that's the kind of way that it activates placemaking. So not directly, but in that way.
Most definitely. And Ingrid, you had mentioned it during your presentation. And is there a factor that really has stood out for you in order to be able to actually see how the advancement of such a vision can actually happen?
The placemaking project I talked about was an outcome of a community-based health impact assessment that was connected to my research project on gentrification in the North End. And one of the things that the participants said during the research was that we're feeling like we're losing our community. People are coming into our community, people who are not African Nova Scotian community, who are not members of the African Nova Scotian community, and act like we don't belong. They act like they don't see us. We're here. And they walk past us. So it was a way to make the community more visible. They talked about many different types of means by which they could feel seen, including having a sign as you enter the North End that says, this is a historic African Nova Scotian community. They bandied around quite a few ideas, but I think that idea was important because it brought together members of the community who led that project, and the artist was African Nova Scotian from the community. So I think what it did was simply give people a sense of inclusion, identity, belonging. Those things are spiritual. I mean, I can't break it down in any other way. It's spiritual, it's emotional, it's ultimately a health issue. And so for me, that's most important. It didn't necessarily lead to anything else, but it gave them something that was missing that I can only describe as spiritual, and was an outcome of that. We call it a CHIAT, I guess, a community-driven health impact assessment, where they got together with decision makers to look at the research that I did and then make decisions about what they thought would be harmful or positive in their community. And that was one of the suggestions that they made. And it actually, not everything was realized in terms of what they wanted, but that was one tangible thing that was realized in the community.
Great. And Carlton, as far as the communities that you actually have outlined in the examples that you shared, from Bayview to one community in South Carolina, have you noticed an effort as to more of a groundbreaking type of push toward creating these placemaking efforts that build these communities?
Well, based on my experience, I mean, the most impactful placemaking project that I often reference is actually the 18th and Vine Jazz District in Kansas City, Missouri, because the 18th and Vine neighborhood used to be the heart of the African-American community in Kansas City. The Negro League baseball team, the Kansas City Monarchs, many of the players actually lived in that neighborhood. Actually, the Charlie Bird Parker, Count Basie, as jazz artists, used to play in that neighborhood. And actually, it had its own placemaking dividend. Emmanuel Cleaver, when he was a city council member, he's now a U.S. congressman, but when he was a council member, he said that we have to be intentional about balancing the goals of economic development and cultural development. And it was based on that type of vision that the 18th and Vine Jazz District was created, whereby they were able to create museums that were dedicated to the Negro Leagues, as well as museums that were dedicated to preserve Kansas City's jazz history. They put in place sculpture that was designed to reflect Charlie Bird Parker in terms of an artist who was identified with that particular neighborhood. The African American Archives of Middle America is actually based in the 18th and Vine Jazz District itself. So I'm saying all that to simply amplify the fact that Kansas City is probably one of the best places that I've seen that has been deliberate and intentional about preserving African American culture, the intangibles that contribute towards a sense of place. And whereas we've often seen in so many large cities that have been experiencing the process of transitioning, often those historic and cultural assets get compromised through the process of gentrification. And instead in Kansas City, they were able to take the initiative to make sure that as early as the late 1980s, that they designated the importance of preserving those assets because they contributed towards.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Carlton, for sharing that. And I think that one of the points that you raised, the idea of sense of place is crucial toward being able to really see how environmental justice really does create these spaces that people want to actually be a part of. And it's something that happens through time. It's not something that's just labeled. So I think that the idea of sense of place is crucial toward the understanding of how environmental justice can result into something that is actually really fruitful for communities. So again, thank you so much, Ingrid, Katherine, Carlton, for taking the time this evening to enrich us with your presentations, at the same time with the examples and the future and the future objectives that you all put forward. Really enjoyed the discussions as well as the examples that you've shared. I think that at this particular point, since we're coming to the end of the event, I just want to again thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Carlton, especially for celebrating your Thanksgiving with us. Thank you for taking the time. And on that particular note, for myself, as well as the team of professionals that are behind the scenes, bringing you this fabulous event, that have been working diligently in order to be able to make this as smoothly as possible a process for everyone to listen and to hear and to educate themselves on. Again, a formal thank you to everyone involved. And the next National Capital Commission event will take place in December, and we'll probably focus more on planning in the age of a pandemic. And so I hope that everyone that is viewing this event will be able to come back in order to be able to educate themselves on a topic that is fruitful within the time being that we're living today. So good health to everyone, and we will be back hopefully in a month to be able to celebrate another great event. Again, my name is Gary Muse, representing the National Capital Commission, and I thank you for your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.